In this video, my aim will be to give a solid argument for the existence of God, known as the Kalam cosmological argument. I'll also be defending the argument from its wide variety of detractors here on YouTube. Now, this video on the Kalam argument, I'm just going to warn you from the beginning, is going to be very long, so don't feel any obligation to try and watch it all in one sitting. There's a lot of information that I'm going to present here. There's a lot of counter arguments I'm going to be critiquing, so if your brain starts to swell, just, go take a break, maybe watch some TV, watch some Lost, best show ever made, by the way. But please do watch this entire video. I apologize for the length, but it's the shortest I could cut it given all of the necessary content. Now here's the table of contents for this video. You can either watch it all the way through or click on a specific part of the video that interests you. As you can see, there's both the presentation of the argument broken down into parts, as well as some critiques of challenges to the Kalam argument. I suggest you start at the beginning of the video and watch it all the way through, but since this video is going to be extremely long, just do what you can. Now, from what I've seen from the majority of atheists on YouTube, this argument is somewhat misunderstood. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's strawman more than any other type of argument that comes out of the theistic camp. Because this argument is so easy to understand in its syllogistic form, I think people hop right into trying to debunk it without really taking the time to consider each premise. Now, this argument can be presented in one of two ways. It can be presented as a syllogism. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. William Lane Craig is famous for arguing this way. He's made a career out of it. But I want to present the argument a little differently this time. It's essentially the same argument, but this time I want to unpack it as three exhaustive dilemmas, and this has been done before, and I think this is a more robust way of presenting the argument. An exhaustive dilemma is essentially an either-or statement in which one of the two options has to be true. There's no third option. A person has to hold to one of these two options. But don't let this confuse you. The argument is still very easy to understand. The three exhaustive dilemmas look like this. The universe either had a beginning or no beginning. If it had a beginning, the beginning was either caused or uncaused. If it was caused, the cause was either personal or impersonal. So these are the three exhaustive dilemmas. Now the Kalam argument says that the universe had a beginning, that the beginning of the universe was caused, and that the cause of the universe was personal. And we're going to offer arguments for each of these premises. Now let's look at the first claim that the universe had a beginning. The Big Bang Theory stands firm as the most widely accepted view concerning the origin of the universe. Now, all of us have at least some knowledge of what the Big Bang is. We've all had middle school or high school astronomy, or at least heard of the theory one way or another. But the relevant concept behind the Big Bang Theory is that as you go back further and further in time, the universe gets progressively denser. As you go further into the past, you eventually arrive at a state referred to as the singularity, which becomes an edge to space-time. Now, the singularity is referred to as a point of infinite density. It's not like it's so often presented by atheists as this little dot of compacted matter that just sits there and hangs out, some would say from an eternity's past, until it just explodes one day. Rather, it's referred to as a point of infinite density, but infinite density is equivalent to nothingness, and I'll explain this a bit more in a moment. But suffice it to say that it's a complete misunderstanding of the Big Bang to think that all that the Big Bang shows us is that there was this little compacted dot of matter that just existed and suddenly exploded into what we see now. Cosmologists John Barrow and Frank Tipler put it this way. At the singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity, so if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo. And so there is an actual beginning of the universe. The Big Bang Theory gives us a picture of the universe that is not eternal, but instead began a finite time ago. It came into existence, and this is just a widely accepted scientific concept. In fact, Stephen Hawking, in his 1996 book, The Nature of Space and Time, said, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now, I don't think the Big Bang is actually the best argument for the finitude of the universe. I'm going to give that one in a few minutes. But first, I want to defend the veracity of the Big Bang. So how do we know the Big Bang happened? Well, for one, the phenomena of redshift. Think of an object moving toward you at a very fast speed, like a car. When you're on a street corner and you see a car fly by you, the sound of the car gets louder as it gets closer to you, and when it passes, it starts to fade again. It's like, vroom, that sort of thing. Well, light sort of does something analogous. When light approaches you, the wavelengths are shorter and shift towards the blue end of the spectrum. Now, what science has discovered is that entire galaxies are shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. This means that galaxies are emitting light that has a wavelength longer than it ought to be if those objects were simply stationary. So you understand, if the galaxies were stationary, the wavelengths would be a specific sort of wavelength, but they're not. They shift toward the red end of the spectrum in basically every direction that we look. So consequently, it looks as though galaxies are actually accelerating from all the other galaxies. Now pause for a second and rewind this process. Go backward in time and think about what's happening. Everything's being reversed. When we go back to roughly about 13.7 billion years, we have all of the mass in the known universe congealed into an unextended mathematical point, a point of infinite density, a singularity. So this mass congeals back into a point of infinite density, which basically means it has a density divided by zero, which is mathematically unintelligible. It's nothing, basically. So from this now, from nothing, you have space, time, and matter coming into existence. So you don't think of the Big Bang explosion as something that took place in space. Okay, space comes from it. It's literally the boundary of space and time which both flow from this event. We also see remnants of the Big Bang today in the form of uniform background radiation. Think about, I don't know if a lot of you did this when you were a kid. I was crazy. So you go in your backyard and you light an M80 firecracker. And you set it down, you light it, boom, it goes off. Now after it explodes, if you go back to the area where it went off and you just check the dirt around it, check the area around it, you're going to find a little bit of heat. And if you wait longer, let's say you wait a few more minutes, you come back, there's still going to be heat, but it's going to have cooled down a bit. Now, science has predicted that if the Big Bang Theory is true, if there really was an event in which the universe basically exploded into existence from no dimensions of space and time, there should be evidence of a sort of low-level radiation present in every direction of the universe. And you know what? That's exactly what they found. They found heat equally distributed throughout the universe, irrespective of direction, and this is evidence of the universe coming into existence. So the Big Bang Theory is a rigorous model that predicts exactly what we see with rich mathematical precision, and it suggests both a finite past and the creation of the universe from nothing. Now, I wanted to add another argument here, but I really don't have the time for it, and that's the second law of thermodynamics. However, since I can already foresee this video being extremely long, I'm just going to leave it out. Now, this last argument for the universe having a beginning, in my mind, is the best. If you can get this, it's going to be one of those light bulb moments. And it's the impossibility of crossing infinity. Think of something with me. If you were to add 100 million to infinity, you'd still have infinity. If you subtracted 100 million from infinity, you'd still have infinity. So from this, we see that infinity plus or minus any other number is infinity. Now here's the claim. It's impossible to cross infinity one step at a time. This is just the nature of infinity. So from the idea that infinity plus or minus any number is still infinity, it follows that it's impossible to cross infinity by addition or succession or progression. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose I swallow a magical vial of liquid that just basically allows me to live forever. I never age, I never die. Okay. Now suppose I tell myself that from here on out, I want to spend the rest of my seemingly never-ending existence counting all of the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So I start doing this, and I eventually get up to the number 100 quintillion. And I'm still standing there counting away. Now, while I'm standing there, another guy approaches me who informs me that he is also drunk from the same vial, and he is allowed to live forever in the same way I am, and he wants to start counting with me. Okay, we have nothing better to do with our longevity, apparently. So this guy gets up to about the number 43, and I'm a little over 100 quintillion. So, I raise my eyebrow, and I'm like, this guy's totally pwned. He's nowhere near my caliber of digits at all. But then something dawns on me. It dawns on me that I've really made no progress whatsoever because I still have the same number left to count as this other guy, namely an infinite number. So I rubbed my head and I started thinking, no matter how far I count, I've actually made no progress because I could literally count forever and I would always be at a finite number. And paradoxically, I would always have an infinite number of numbers to count ahead of me. So the idea of this exercise is to show that it's impossible to go from 0 to infinity by succession. And likewise, it's impossible to go from a sort of minus infinity to 0. Now, I want you to think about the past with me and look at something. Now, look at this horribly inartistic slide, okay? We have, forgive me for that, I'm not very artsy here. We have the present moment 1 year ago, and if you go back even further, we have 50 billion years ago. Now, as you keep going back, the important question to keep in mind is there an edge back there? Is there an edge back there? If there were an edge, that would be the beginning. And if there is no beginning, well, then this model kind of goes back to a minus infinity. Do you see that? Now, since it's impossible to cross infinity, and we established this earlier, if the universe has always been here, if it's existed eternally, regardless of whatever state it's existed in, the present moment could have never arisen. You see, in order for the present moment to arrive or to be actualized, this would mean that yesterday would have had to be arrived at and be actualized, and the day before that, and then the day before that. And this would mean that the universe would have literally had to run through and cross an infinite number of previous moments in order to reach the present moment, which is impossible. So, in other words, the past would have had to cross infinity to come to the present moment if the universe did not begin to exist a finite time ago. And if this were the case, the present moment could have never arisen. Now, I hope you followed me up until this point, because here is where it gets really weird. If you believe the universe has always existed, if you go back just to any point in the past, let's say 100 quintillion years, how many years or days or hours or moments or quantum moments did the universe have to traverse or go through in order to get to this moment? It's infinite. See, what we're asking is how a beginningless universe could ever get a series of sequential times started. How could that happen? It's quite literally impossible, because you can't begin a beginningless situation. So we've argued for the premise that the universe had a beginning, and we discussed the Big Bang is seen through the redshift and cosmic microwave background radiation, as well as the impossibility of crossing infinity. So we have a pair of scientific considerations and a philosophical one in defense of the idea that the universe had a beginning. Now we will look at the second premise, that the beginning of the universe was caused. There is a proposition that says whatever comes into existence has a cause. And this is a rendition of the first premise of the Kalam argument in its syllogistic form. So whatever comes into existence has a cause. Now, there's actually a couple ways we can look at this. We can look at this principle as a sort of empirical idea, an empirical principle, or we can look at it as a metaphysical principle. And let me explain the difference between the two. If we take this proposition to be an empirical principle, it's an inductive generalization. Another way of describing it would be to say that although it could be false, there has never been a discovery of anything that really violates this. You know, every time we've encountered something that comes into existence, there's been a cause for it coming into existence. There are no counterexamples to this. This would include quantum phenomena, and I'm going to hold off explaining on why until the objections section of the video, because this is a road we're surely going to travel. Now, we can look at this proposition, whatever comes into existence has a cause, as a metaphysical principle. In this case, it would be a necessary truth, something that actually could not be false. Now, this is actually how I want to argue this position. If we take the claim whatever comes into existence has a cause as a metaphysical principle, then it's not merely a principle of science. It's not just an inductive generalization. It applies to all reality. It's a metaphysical principle. Now, I want to defend this metaphysical principle by looking at the concept of nothingness, of nothing, because this concept really, I think, gets to the crux of the matter. We can think of nothingness for our purposes as the absence of all reality whatsoever. It's not like how your mind automatically wants to picture nothingness as like this black void, because that's still something, right? You're actually envisioning space. Nothingness has no being whatsoever. Now, keep in mind what we're arguing here. We know the universe came into existence, so the question is, was this caused or was it uncaused? Keep that in mind as we continue. Now, if nothing whatsoever existed, there would be no material, nor agent, nor force. There would be nothing that could generate a universe. Sheer nothingness could not generate something. That's the point. That's the insight of this metaphysical principle. Now, what I want to talk about next is both an answer to an objection to the Kalam, as well as something that I think will push us forward in this discussion. And it's the idea of something coming into existence, okay? And I want to argue that coming into existence is actually an instantaneous happening. It doesn't require the passage of time. Okay, keyword, doesn't require it, and I'll show you why. Consider when you walked into the room that you're in now. When you did that, there were certain points before you totally entered the room in which you were 0% in the room, maybe 20% in the room, 90% in the room, etc. So entering a room is sort of a process. It's a process where a person alters their location from being outside of a room to inside of a room. So there's sort of a transition here from one state to another. Now, compare that with something existing. Okay, something either exists or it doesn't exist. It doesn't make any sense to say that something is 40% existent, but 60% non-existent, or 30% real, but 70% unreal. There's no 60-40, 50-50, anything like that. Either something exists or it doesn't. Coming into existence would have to be an instantaneous event because it's not a 60-40, 50-50 type of thing. And from this, from the idea that something either exists or it doesn't, it follows that a law of nature could not govern something popping into existence. Laws of nature govern only things that already exist. They can't lay hold of non-existent things and just pop them into existence. So from this, we see that there cannot even in principle be a scientific explanation for something just popping into existence, because you can't apply scientific explanations until you have the thing already existing. Okay? But here's another problem. If something could actually come into existence out of nothing, there would be no reason to think it would be a universe as opposed to an Acura Integra or a ham sandwich or a mop. I mean, take your pick. Coming into existence out of nothing without a cause is just the pinnacle example of inexplicability. There's no reason to think it would be a universe as opposed to something else like a backpack. It's just totally inexplicable. And as I said previously, there's in principle no way science could explain it anyway, because the laws of science don't apply until the thing already exists. So the idea of something coming into existence uncaused as opposed to cause, out of nothing, which is what would be required, is fundamentally incoherent. So as you can see, we have good reason to believe that the universe had a beginning and that the beginning of the universe was caused. Now, we're going to look at the last part of the argument, which says that the cause of the universe was personal. Now, this is generally where atheists like to comically ask, why think it's God and not an invisible pink unicorn? Failing, of course, to see that being both pink and invisible is a contradiction in terms to begin with, or, the flying spaghetti monster or a magic teapot or what have you. But what this does is it fails to recognize how the theist is coming to the conclusion that the cause of the universe is what we call God. To start, the theist does this by merely looking at the nature of the case. I mean, right off the bat, we can reasonably infer that the cause of the universe is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, because the three of these things, space, time, and matter, flow from the actual creation event. So whatever caused these things to come into existence is not spatial, temporal, or material. Now, that sort of thing may blow your mind, but it's not incoherent or contradictory, okay? Now, when we look at the nature of causation, okay, we see a couple kind of distinct causes in the world. There are events that are causes of other events, and then there are agents that are causes, events and agents. Event causation is something you see happen every day. For example, it's the lightning hitting the tree that causes the tree to split in two. It's the earthquake in the ocean floor that causes the tsunami. I mean, these are events that carry a number of specific properties. They're governed by law, whether you say that it's deterministic or probabilistic. And the important thing is that they all presuppose time. Event causation presupposes time. So these are all the types of events where one event causes another event. This is primarily the impersonal material world that science investigates. All of the causes investigated by science are events, and their effects are events as well. The event of the earthquaking at the bottom of the ocean causes the event of the tsunami. And these events, as I said, are governed by natural law. Now, the important thing to note here is that when you're dealing with these sorts of impersonal causes that subsequently produce these sorts of impersonal effects, impersonal natural effects, you always have to have time already existing. This sort of causation always embodies the transition from one state to another state, and you always have to have time existing before the natural laws apply. Now, this kind of causation is insufficient to explain the origin of time, because this kind of cause can't work until you already have time. So the cause of the beginning of the universe could not be an impersonal cause, because impersonal causes behave according to the laws of nature and require time in order to work. So in other words, when we have an impersonal cause, we have an event causing a later event. If the effect in this case is the beginning of the universe, the cause would have to be an event that was prior to the beginning of time. And you can't have events before time exists. Hence, the cause of the universe cannot be impersonal. Now, as I said, there's a second type of cause that exists, and it's agent causation. Agent causation. An example of agent causation would be for me to freely raise my hand. So if there really are agent causes, then they're free. But most importantly, they're events that involve total spontaneous action and are undetermined by anything that happened prior to that action. Now, when I raise my hand, when I act freely, my reason for acting, my reason, is what's called a final cause, or that for the sake of which an effect is produced. Remember, Aristotle discussed 4 different types of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. And a final cause is the goal or the purpose for which an effect is produced. Now, follow me here, okay? An efficient cause is simply what produces the effect. A final cause is that for the sake of which that effect is produced. Now, when I act freely, like when I raise my hand, I am the efficient cause. Noah, I'm what's producing the effect. And my reason for this action is the final cause. Maybe I want to prove a point by raising my hand. Now, when you look at action this way, okay, I am essentially an unmoved mover. Nothing causes me to cause my hand to go up. All things being equal, I freely choose it. So a free action takes place spontaneously without anything prior to it causing it to happen. Now, in free actions like this, there didn't have to be a past. Okay, there didn't have to be a past, because nothing that happens prior to the moment of acting actually causes the action to happen. Do you see that? So there did not have to be a past for this sort of free action to take place. Now, this is how a personal being is required to create the universe. If we act freely, we're essentially prime movers. I'm the absolute originator of my actions, and nothing caused me to act. Now, a moved mover would be something like the earthquaking at the bottom of the ocean. The earthquake has to be produced before it can cause the tsunami, but a free agent is different. There's nothing prior to the free action that causes the action to occur. So the cause of the universe could not be an impersonal cause. It had to have been a personal cause. And so it seems that the most reasonable explanation for the universe, for the origin of the universe, is the existence of a non-temporal, non-spatial, immaterial being with the power of total spontaneous action, and that is why the universe exists. Now, if you're like me, you already have a list of objections formed in your mind right now that you're just ready to throw at me. I can already see you writing them down. So here's what I'm going to do. My intent from here on out in this video is going to be to defend the Kalam argument from many of the objections that surround the argument here on YouTube. About 2.5 years ago, I actually remember searching for the Kalam argument here on YouTube, and I only think there was like 5 or 6 videos back then on the topic. There just wasn't much discussion about it on YouTube. Nobody really addressed it in depth. However, today there are scores of videos discussing the Kalam argument, and much to my dismay, many of them are simply mischaracterizations of the argument, or, in my opinion, lackluster responses. So what I want to do is tackle a large number of the responses in this video all at once, and give an overall defense of the argument from some of the common objections you're likely to hear. Probably the most common misunderstanding of this argument is the retort that if everything needs a cause, and God exists and created the universe, then God needs a cause. Let me give you an example of this.
They say that everything has a cause, often going so far as to assert that this is a law of some sort, and therefore the universe must have a cause. And they usually go on to characterize this cause as some kind of intelligence, which somehow takes the form of a god as described by one religion or another. So I reply, if everything must have a cause, and the universe was created by a god, what caused this god to exist?
And you'll hear this over and over again from people. You know, they think you're saying that everything has a cause, but that's in fact not what the theist is saying in this case. The theist is saying everything that comes into existence has a cause. Now, to be fair, some theists actually do naively argue the way this guy is critiquing. And yes, that's a guy, by the way, in the video. So I do think his point is fair if you actually find a person arguing this way. However, I implore the atheist to ascend past arguing against obviously, you know, poor reasoning like this and deal with substantive arguments that come out of our camp. It's not hard to address somebody who argues the way this guy is critiquing. However, most theists who offer any substantive food for thought don't argue this way. Now, luckily, the same guy addresses the correct form of the argument.
And they respond by telling me that this law, that everything must have a cause, only applies to the universe, and a cause is only required for something that begins to exist, whereas this God has existed forever. And this is where we reach an impasse, because there's no point arguing with someone who's willing to so casually make assumptions without backing them up, and then selectively apply these laws that they've come up with for the benefit of their own argument.
Okay, so notice a couple things immediately. The first is that he never addresses the point. He simply walks away from the discussion. He doesn't offer any response to this. He just says, you know, we're at an impasse. I don't want to argue with you any longer, and that's that. Secondly, he's completely misunderstanding every possible aspect of what's being argued. The consideration we're asking this guy to ponder is a metaphysical proposition applying to all reality that says whatever comes into existence has a cause for it coming into existence. That's not an assumption, that's a premise of the argument when it's formed as a syllogism. If you can think of something that violates this principle, bring it to the table. But you can't just dismiss our theistic conception of God because you don't like it. Okay, the Christian theist at least would say that our conception of God is one in which his existence is necessary and brute. It is to say that there has never been a state of affairs in which God did not exist. And this is what we believe. Now look, maybe you don't believe that, and that's fine. But you can't just sit back and say, well, isn't that convenient, and think that that means anything beyond mere emotive commentary. The atheist will typically say something like, well, yeah, well, why should I accept that conception of God over any of the other religions out there? And my answer would be, well, you don't have to accept that one, but that's the one I accept. That's the one I'm debating. And as I argued in previous videos, this notion of God is not arbitrary, and it isn't created in order to engage in special pleading because of the issue of an infinite regress. Let me show you what I mean. And I've said this in a previous video. I think I just mentioned that, actually. Something in my eye. Hold on. Can I see? Yes, I can still see. Okay, so you know, suppose person A wants to borrow a mouse for their computer. So person A goes to person B and says, hey, can I borrow a mouse from you? And person B says, sure. I don't have one, but I'll go borrow one. So he goes to person C and says, hey, my buddy person A over there would like to borrow a mouse. Can I borrow one from you? And person C says, sure, but I don't have one. So let me go ask person D. And person D does the exact same thing to person E. Now, this could continue to go on forever. And you know what? Person A would never get that mouse. Because every member of the regress here is a borrowing lender. If person A is ever going to get that mouse, you're going to have to stop somewhere with a person who owns the actual mouse to lend. In order for person A to get that mouse, you're going to have to stop with something that isn't like the rest of the members in the series. All of the rest of the members in the series don't have the thing they're trying to pass on to the next member. So for person A to ever get that mouse, you're going to have to stop somewhere with a person who actually has the possession. If not, this could literally go on forever and person A would never get that mouse. So this is a vicious regress. Vicious not because of the length of the regress, but because of the nature of it. The very nature of this is that every member depends on the next for something it doesn't have. You have to stop with a first mouse owner or first mover. This will be a person who differs from everyone else in that they have what everyone else needs down the chain. Now, replace the mouse with existence. Suppose A is a being. A owes its existence to something else, which owes its existence to something else, which owes its existence to something else. And what you have here is a series in which every member is a borrowing lender of existence. If the chain doesn't stop with something that simply exists without getting it from something else, nothing will exist. So there has to be an uncaused cause, which theologians refer to as a self-existent being, a being that exists in and of itself without borrowing its existence from something else. So this concept of God is not arbitrary, nor does it engage in special pleading. Okay? Now, the next mistake people make when addressing the Kalam cosmological argument is huge. And to be honest, I'm always taken aback when I hear this next statement because it just flies in the face of one of the most rigorous, mathematically consistent, and confirmed theories in science. And that is the statement that the Big Bang does not show that the universe had a beginning.
First of all, the Big Bang model of the universe does not say that something came from nothing. This is a common misconception, unfortunately, and it needs to be corrected. What the Big Bang model really says is that something came from something. The universe appears to have expanded from a very small, hot and dense singularity about 13.7 billion years ago.
Scientists have never shown that the universe had a beginning. Science or cosmology and physics has shown that the universe has evolved from a hot, dense state to a much cooler, much less dense state that it's in now. It's not shown that the universe actually had any kind of genesis, and it's not shown that time had a beginning.
Okay, folks, this is absolutely false. Before I give you some considerations as to why it's false, let me at least tell you what the experts have to say. Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Stephen Hawking. At this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. If the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo. John Barrow and Frank Tipler. It belongs analytically to the concept of the cosmological singularity that it is not the effect of some effect of prior physical events. The definition of a singularity entails that it is impossible to extend the space-time manifold beyond the singularity. This rules out the idea that the singularity is an effect of some prior natural process. Quentin Smith. If we extrapolate this prediction to its extreme, we reach a point when all distances in the universe have shrunk to zero. An initial cosmological singularity, therefore, forms a past temporal extremity to the universe. We cannot continue physical reasoning or even the concept of space-time through such an extremity. For this reason, most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but also space-time itself. The coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Okay? See, having an initial singularity that just exists from an eternity's past treats the singularity as this thing that exists in space-time, which is false because space and time come from the singularity, not vice versa. Remember, this is why Quentin Smith says the definition of a singularity entails that it is impossible to extend the space-time manifold beyond the singularity. There's no physical reality prior to the singularity. So you don't think of this Big Bang explosion as something that took place in space. Like I said earlier, space comes from it. It's literally the boundary of space and time which both flow from this event. So this idea that there has existed from an eternity's past this little dot of compacted matter that suddenly exploded into existence is not what the Big Bang Theory says. Okay, that's simply a mischaracterization. Space, time, and matter came into existence, and this is what the Big Bang Theory is telling us. And I'm sorry if that conclusion doesn't sit well with an atheistic or non-theistic view of the world, but that's simply the fact of the matter. I think the cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin said it best. It's said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and proof is what it takes to convince an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And folks, so do you. So let's look at some more objections here. And by the way, sorry if it seems like I'm really picking on this one guy so much. He seems to be arguing right down the list of common objections that you hear. And he does so, so perfectly.
Or alternatively, we could say that there's a chain of causes and effects that extends infinitely into the past, which eventually led to the Big Bang.
Okay, so there could have been, a chain of events that leads infinitely into the past that eventually caused the Big Bang. Now, I hope that I've shown that this already conflicts with modern cosmology. This view is already at odds with what science is telling us, which, by the way, I find it interesting that when an atheist denies the overwhelmingly supported conclusions of modern science, that's okay. But when a religious person does it, they're fundamentalist nutcases who have mental impairments and who can't look at the world for what it is. This is how young earth creationists are labeled for things like the flood and the age of the earth. But when an atheist flat out disagrees with one of the most overwhelming, accurate cosmological models we have, nobody says anything. I wonder why. But I digress. Aside from the fact that this view that there could have been a chain of events that leads infinitely into the past that eventually caused the Big Bang, aside from the fact that it flies in the face of modern science, it can be shown to be false from a philosophical standpoint as well. Apparently not a linguistic standpoint. As I argued, this would mean that the universe would have had to traverse an infinite number of moments or quantum moments in order to get to the present moment, which is not possible. What this guy's arguing is just not possible at all. Now, let's look at some of the arguments that come from people who seem to understand the argument a bit better. You'll remember we discussed a principle that says whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, some people deny this on the basis that this is only meaningful with things in the universe, but not the universe as a whole.
The second reason why the Kalam argument is invalid and refuted is that the two premises that support the conclusion both commit compositional errors. This is because the premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, commits the fallacy of composition because, to quote Francois Tremblay, the first premise tries to infer a necessary causality on a whole, the universe, on the basis of observation of such attribute in the parts, the existence around us.
So his first point, that everything that has a beginning has a cause, is true for everyday objects. I'm not saying that that first point he is making is false. That's true. But applying it to the universe as a whole is meaningless.
So when someone comes at me with the Kalam cosmological argument, as they often do, probably because it's got the word cosmology in it, I simply say to them that it's naive to think that these properties must apply to our universe simply because they apply in our universe.
Okay, so in other words, the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause is true of things in the universe, but not the universe as a whole. This is often referred to as committing the fallacy of composition. But this objection shows a real lack of understanding as to what this metaphysical principle is saying. This objection treats this principle as a sort of inductive generalization or an empirical idea, when in fact this is not the case at all. This principle is a metaphysical concept, which means it applies to all reality, including the universe. It says nothing can come into existence uncaused, and this principle rather is something that applies to reality as a whole. It's a concept that applies to all reality. It's a metaphysical principle. So it's a misunderstanding to say that it only applies to things within the universe, because that treats it as an empirical principle or physical principle, when it's in fact a metaphysical principle that applies to all reality as a whole. The next counter to the Kalam argument is also used quite often, and to be honest, I've never understood how anyone can think this retort is not absurd. I'll go ahead and let Andromeda's Wake explain it.
But the big part here is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, I challenge anyone who espouses the Kalam cosmological argument to demonstrate that anything has ever begun to exist, or indeed to point to anything that we know has begun to exist. There is simply nothing known in nature that has begun to exist.
Okay, so nothing in nature ever began to exist because energy or matter simply rearranges. In fact, Theoretical BS has argued this way in one of his recent videos on the Kalam argument. And the challenge is to think of one thing that has ever come into existence. And so my answer is me. I came into existence. There was a point or a state of affairs in which I, Noah, did not exist. But now I do exist. I came into existence. I mean, are we seriously supposed to believe that I have always existed? Because that's what would follow from this line of reasoning. If I never came into existence, then the only alternatives are either that I don't exist or that I have always existed. Now, I don't not exist, so surely what we're left with is absurd. You don't honestly expect me to believe that I existed in 1855 or during the time of Socrates or something like that. I'm sorry I didn't exist then. And if I did, I would tell you, because that would mean I'm awesome. Things do come into existence. Listen, just because matter or energy can only be rearranged or changed does not mean that it follows that things cannot or do not come into existence. That's just a horrible treatment of ontology. It conflates who we are with what we're made of, with what we're made out of. There are things true of us as as people that are not true of our atomic constituents. I have essential properties that if I lose, I cease to exist. So the material components from which I'm formed may have existed since the origin of the universe, but that doesn't mean I have. I mean, doesn't this objection, whether you're an atheist or not, doesn't it strike you as intuitively absurd? Bill Craig put it this way: if such a conclusion is not evidently absurd, reflect. I have certain essential properties, properties without which I could not exist. For example, it's essential to me that I am a human being. But my atoms prior to my conception were not a human being, therefore they were not I. To me, this is the most ridiculous objection to the Kalam argument and a testament to how far people are willing to go in order to avoid a theistic conclusion. So let's look at some more counters to the Kalam argument.
The first reason why the Kalam argument is invalid and refuted is that it commits the logical fallacy of begging the question. This is because the phrase "whatever begins to exist" is not presumed to accommodate anything other than God, and that puts God to the definition of the premise of the argument that is supposed to prove his existence in the first place.
Okay, big problems here. Big problems here. First off, what is the fallacy of begging the question? Well, this is when a premise includes the conclusion in order to prove that conclusion. So when we look at the premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and this is how the argument is stated in its syllogistic form, do we see an example of a premise that includes what it's trying to prove? The answer is no, which is why nobody argues this way. This is the only response I've ever heard claiming that the first premise of the Kalam in its syllogistic form is question begging. Perhaps I've just missed this sort of counter, which is certainly possible. If we take the conclusion to be, we have good reason to believe that God exists, it still isn't question begging. If we take the conclusion to be the universe has a cause, this still isn't question begging. Dorpatan seems to have misunderstood what begging the question actually is. God is nowhere in the premise whatever begins to exist has a cause. He's nowhere in the premise, and the conclusion is not assumed in the premise in order to prove it. So this is just a horrible response. And on a side note, you know, one would think, one would think that a professional philosopher spending their entire careers defending two premises of an argument, like William Lane Craig does, would be wise enough to see that it commits such a gross and obvious fallacy of logic like begging the question. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but if that's all that's required to invalidate the argument, such an obvious failure of logic, you would think people would be all over it in debates and things like that, but they're not. And that doesn't mean the argument actually doesn't beg the question, but you know, just something to think about. Just something to ponder. The next objection is a rather large one, so I'm going to dedicate the rest of this video to addressing it. It's an objection from quantum mechanics. So the first part of Antibu 86 objection discusses how it's a common misconception that the universe came into existence literally out of nothing, like I argued previously. Here's what he says.
Dr. Craig usually then goes on to quote various physicists and philosophers who plainly say that the Big Bang occurred from nothing. And to be fair, physicists do often say this, especially in the context of explaining the Big Bang to an audience that is unfamiliar with the intimate details of physics.
Today, we have the Big Bang, the equally remarkable idea that the universe simply began from nothing.
There's really nothing. There's no space, there's no time, there's no matter, there's no energy. It's nothing but the potential to exist. And out of that bursts the universe.
The problem here is that what most of us might think of as nothing is in fact not what physicists are talking about. As NASA astronomer Dr. Sten Odenwald writes, when physicists say nothing, they are being playful with the English language, because we often think of the vacuum as being empty or nothing, when in fact physicists know full well that the vacuum is far from empty. Nothingness was not nothing, but it was not anything like the kinds of somethings we know about today. We have no words to describe it, and the ones we borrow that are listed in the Oxford English Dictionary are based on the wrong physical insight.
Okay, so with this statement in mind, I became a bit perplexed because I've actually always heard quite the opposite from what this fellow is saying. As I said previously, Barrow and Tipler said in their 1986 book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, that the same thing that's echoed by most cosmologists today. At the singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. So we have this phrase literally nothing, which denotes emphasis. In fact, the edge of space-time itself is referred to as the singularity, which is a point of infinite density, and infinite density is equivalent to nothingness. And again, I've just always heard the term nothing in a way that denotes the absence of all reality whatsoever, including virtual particles and quantum vacuums, because that's at least something. Also, the astronomer you quoted, his last statement seems it seems linguistically inadequate. He says, nothingness was not nothing, but it was not anything like the kinds of somethings we know about today. We have no words to describe it. And the ones we borrow that are listed in the Oxford English Dictionary are based on the wrong physical insight. Now, I'm not totally sure what this is even supposed to mean. I mean, I kind of see what he's saying. Yeah, it isn't really nothing, but it isn't something either. But I just don't even know if that's intelligible. If there's no words to describe it like he's saying, then how can it be established science? How does it even add to our body of knowledge if we can't even discuss it correctly? Are we to believe that something we can't even ascribe a coherent description of is truly a scientific concept? This is not an epistemic or an epistemological limitation. Science is filled with epistemological limitations. Rather, it's pushing the boundaries of coherence. I mean, what this man is saying may not even be coherent. I further wish he would have unpacked this a bit more, because I don't think quantum vacuums and virtual particles actually do the trick, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the major idea that Antibu is setting up concerning quantum mechanics, and anytime quantum mechanics are discussed in these regards, I mean, I roll my eyes, because quantum mechanics is used to explain almost anything now, by both atheists and by theists. It's like, it's like a magical answer to everything we don't fully understand. It's like a naturalism of the gaps. But this is just way too shaky ground to stake the centerpiece of an argument on. I mean, in the first place, these are all theoretical entities we're talking about here, virtual particles, etc. This is theoretical physics to begin with. Secondly, there are nearly a dozen interpretations of quantum phenomena, a dozen, and some of them are actually deterministic, like hidden variables interpretation. And the big problem is that every single one of them is consistent with the same data. This is the major problem in understanding quantum phenomena. Every single interpretation is consistent with the same sort of data. And in any event, let's watch what Antibu argues here.
And in the quantum world, it is not uncommon for particles to jump in and out of existence without a cause. These particles are called virtual particles, and luckily, Dr. Craig has already addressed this point.
Virtual particles do not come into being uncaused out of nothing. Virtual particles appear in the quantum vacuum, which is a sea of fluctuating energy. It is a rich physical reality endowed with a structure and governed by physical laws. So that when popular magazines and articles portray things coming into being in the vacuum as uncaused out of nothing, they're using the word nothing in a philosophically naive and misleading sense.
But what Dr. Craig fails to realize is that the nothingness from which virtual particles appear is the same nothingness from which the Big Bang singularity appeared, albeit under different circumstances.
Okay, so it should be noted here that virtual particles are based on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which essentially is the idea that given a pair of physical properties, the more precisely you know one physical property, the less likely you know the other. And this is also called the principle of indeterminacy, if I'm not mistaken, which is important because it's not called the principle of acausality, right? I mean, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is not a principle of a causality as it's being purported to be. Rather, it's simply a principle of indeterminacy. Virtual particles coming into existence in a quantum vacuum is not an example of something coming into existence uncaused. The very vacuum is the cause of the virtual particles. It's been argued that it's the nature of the space itself, this quantum vacuum, that is the cause of the virtual particles coming into and out of existence through some non-deterministic process. And if this is the case, then this is not an example of something coming into existence without a cause, and thus this argument fails to take you where it promises. So again, the quantum vacuum is not nothing. As Dr. Craig put it, it's a sea of fluctuating energy, and these virtual particles are contingent upon the quantum vacuum. If there's no vacuum, there's no virtual particles. You know, the sort of subatomic physics we're talking about here takes place in space, and from what I've read, the quantum vacuum can to some degree be understood by physical laws. So it's not as though things come into existence totally uncaused. The very vacuum itself is the cause. Further, I want to argue that this particular notion of acausality being offered by Antibu is actually a misappropriation of quantum physics. Real quantum indeterminacy, okay, is something like the following. A group of scientists have a tiny slit that they begin to shine a beam of electrons through. Now, these electrons can literally land anywhere. And, you know, and the physicists can say, you know, maybe 70% of these electrons are going to land here in spot X, and the other 30% around here in spot Y. But what they cannot do is predict where any single electron would land. If they were to mark somehow, you know, one single electron and follow it, they could not predict where it would land. There would be no reason to think it would be in spot A as opposed to spot B. Now, it's supposed to follow from this that there's no cause for it landing in one place and not the other. So this is purported to be an example of something happening without a cause. This is the relevance of quantum mechanics to the argument that we're discussing here. But as you can see, this is not an issue of causality. Rather, it's an issue of transition, where one thing transitions to another. It has nothing to do with something coming into existence. Secondly, all this in fact shows is that we don't know what the cause is. It doesn't necessarily follow that there isn't a cause. So I think this is a more appropriate example of what quantum phenomena actually offers, and it's not an issue concerned with causality at all. So, with that said, I think the Kalam argument is a sound argument for the existence of God, and I thank you for taking the time to watch this very, very short video of mine.